Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Some of the most senior members of the medical profession have urged junior doctors in England to cancel plans for a series of 5-day strikes over the government's imposition of a new contract. The Academy of Medical Royal Colleges said the action was not proportionate and would harm patients. The doctors' union, the BMA, says it's been left with no choice. Our health editor, Hugh Pym, reports.
This is a big moment for the medical profession. The decision by junior doctors to escalate their strike action in England is unprecedented in the NHS, and at the highest levels there are fears and differences of opinion about the implications. Leaders of the profession at the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges, while noting the doctors' concerns about working conditions, have made it clear the strike action is a step too far.
The Academy has said that, particularly in the current context of all the pressures facing the NHS, that 5 days of industrial action is not a proportionate sort of response. We believe that 5 days of sort of action, particularly with such short notice, will cause real difficulties for patients, for the NHS and for the profession.
But 2 out of the 20 medical college leaders did not sign up to the statement. One of them told me what she thought of the proposed strikes.
We are not taking sides in this argument. We're here to support our members and to speak on behalf of children.
So do you think it is a reasonable action to take for the doctors to make their case?
I think it's a decision for every individual doctor to make. And I know very, very well that each and every one of our members will have thought long and hard about whether or not they will strike or they will not strike.
On the doctors' agenda, some items have been resolved in recent months, such as preventing excessive hours and protecting whistleblowers. But they say issues like weekend pay and provisions for women and part-time workers have not been resolved. The British Medical Association says it's backing junior doctors and their strike plans, and that the action could be halted if the government stopped imposing a new contract. But the latest escalation has made some doctors think hard about the walkout plans.
For patients, it will mean inconvenience. What we are hoping to try and get is, our message really is 5 days of inconvenience for patients to prevent a lifelong inconvenience.
The BMA seems to be committed to further industrial action and a lengthy process of industrial action. I did not vote for that process when I voted to reject the contract, so my preference would be to reballot members about a lengthy process of further industrial action.
The Patients Association said the strike was catastrophic news and the scale of the action was unforgivable. But even with thousands more cancelled operations, it remains to be seen what level of public support there'll be when the 5 days of walkouts take place. Hugh Pym, BBC News.
Well, first it was the Prime Minister, medical leaders and the Patients Association rounding on junior doctors over their plans for 4 fresh rounds of industrial action. Now representatives of hospital trusts in England have formally called on the doctors to cancel the proposed series of 5-day strikes. Theresa May has accused the BMA of playing politics, but it isn't the only union she's taking on. Next week, the RMT will hold strikes once again on the beleaguered Southern Rail network. We'll have more on that in a moment. But first, with the latest on the doctors' dispute, here's our health and social care correspondent, Victoria MacDonald.
In the past week, 2 children's A&E units, one in Stafford and another in Greater Manchester, have closed because of staff shortages. And today, the head of one of the Royal Colleges told Channel 4 News that this, and not the junior doctors' strike, was the biggest threat to patient safety.
No doctor would contemplate strike action easily, but the junior doctors are drawing attention to the fact that their dispute seems to be just the tip of the iceberg of much, much more serious concerns about the way in which our health service is being organised, managed and delivered.
The British Medical Association has announced 5-day strikes for every month until the end of the year over the junior doctors' contract.
In just 10 days' time, there will once again be picket lines outside this hospital, as there will be outside trusts across England, unless there is a last-minute intervention, and certainly there are growing calls for that to happen, including for the Prime Minister herself to step in and stop these unprecedented strikes from going ahead.
We would like her to do what she did with Hinkley Point, for example, and take time to think about it, look at it in real detail and find out from patients and perhaps other members of staff in the health service what needs to be done.
Some members of the Academy of Medical Royal Colleges have described the industrial action as disproportionate, and the NHS Confederation and NHS providers representing all trusts in England have now formally asked the BMA to call off the strikes.
They're probably going to end up, if they go ahead, resulting in 500,000 lost operations and 4 million lost outpatient appointments. That's a huge concern, not just to NHS staff who have to try and run busy hospitals, but obviously to the patients concerned as well.
The Health Secretary wasn't answering questions this morning, but the BMA maintains the government must lift its imposition of the contract. And one junior doctor told us the strikes, though regrettable, were a sign of how strongly they feel.
I think we have to remember that this is about the junior doctor's contract being tied in with this proposal of a truly 7-day NHS, for which there is no funding, there is no plan, there is no staffing. We've just seen today, I read, a maternity unit in Oxford has been closed because there are no junior doctors to man it. This is the reality.
The new contract is due to come into force in October, with the first of the 5-day strikes to begin on September the 12th.
Victoria McDonald reporting.
It would be fair to say at the start of the dispute that junior doctors enjoyed the support of most of their colleagues and quite a number of their patients too, who felt they were right to be taking on the government for trying to impose a strict new contract. But tonight, with a significant compromise rejected and 4 5-day strikes in the pipeline, much of that sympathy, at least from health professionals, appears to be waning. Frontline NHS leaders in England say the strike will risk patient safety. The Patients Association wants the Prime Minister to intervene. And even members of the BMA Council who called the strikes are split in their support. But tonight, junior doctors are standing firm, and so is the government, who, as things stand, still plan to force the new contract upon them.
First, it was the Academy of the Medical Royal Colleges, now the NHS Confederation and NHS providers representing hospital bosses say that whatever the merits of their case, junior doctors should call off their action. In a strongly worded letter to the BMA, they urged them to call off a series of strikes due to start in 10 days' time, which they said were disproportionate. With barely any notice for trusts to prepare, the employers' organisations wrote, this unprecedented level of strike action will cause major disruption and risk patient safety.
All we're saying is that the consequences that we're worried about are 125,000 cancelled operations and 1 million lost outpatient appointments that, to be frank, the NHS simply can't cope with at this point. And that's why we're saying to junior doctors, please think very, very carefully and please reconsider.
Currently, full walkouts are going ahead between 8 a.m. and 5 p.m. from the 12th to the 16th of September, from the 5th to the 7th and the 10th to 11th of October, then from the 14th to the 18th of November, and between the 5th and 9th of December. But why is there such discontent? Junior doctors say the new contract was missold as being about a 7-day NHS, when it was really about stretching the workforce more thinly.
Jeremy Hunt has treated junior doctors like children. He has treated them in the most demoralising way possible. He has not listened to these experts in patient safety who look after patients every day.
But you're really pushing it now, aren't you, going ahead with these all-out strikes?
Whatever they've said about industrial action, every doctor agrees that this contract, as part of the 7-day plan as they stand, is not safe to proceed.
The Health Secretary himself wouldn't comment today.
What are you going to do about that?
But he and the Prime Minister are also facing pressure to resolve the dispute. The Patients Association saying Mrs May should pause the imposition of the contract.
We would like her to do what she did with Hinkley Point, for example, and take time to to think about it, look at it in real detail and find out from patients and perhaps other members of staff in the health service what needs to be done.
Patients may sympathise with the junior doctors, but increasingly they may feel what needs to be done is for the two sides to get together again and resolve this acrimonious dispute.
And Libby is here with me in the studio. Libby, calls there for Theresa May to intervene, but whether she does or not, this is a huge test for her at the start of her premiership.
It is indeed. I mean, when she was choosing the people who would sit in her cabinet, she didn't know that the members of the British Medical Association were actually going to reject the offer that was on the table. And in fact, the leadership of the BMA had said that they should accept it. So she did reappoint Jeremy Hunt as Health Secretary. And I'm told that when he walked up Downing Street, he was very cautious. He didn't use that NHS lapel badge. He didn't wear it as he normally would. I'm told there were cheers in hospitals around the country when they saw that. They thought that he was going to be fired. Yeah. He was gone. When he emerged and he'd been reappointed and he was wearing it, there were sort of looks of horror on people's faces because they really, really do not like the way he's handled this dispute. You heard that junior doctor in my piece there saying that he had treated them like children. I think that's a very widely held view. They think that having looked at the details of the contract, this isn't a very generous offer. And they've also looked at their basic pay. And the basic pay of people who are newly qualified as junior doctors is just £23,000 a year. I think when they are looking at that and have been looking at the fine print, at whatever is an offer in terms of a pay rise, they are extremely unhappy. And I think that perhaps if Theresa May had appointed a new health secretary, there would have been some sense that everyone could move on. But I think with him still in place, there's still a lot of anger there, and that perhaps explains why they've decided on this course of action.
And briefly, that both sides really entrenched in their extreme positions with no sense that they could bridge that gap.
Well, that's how it seems tonight, but I think the pressure really is on both sides now to get back round the table. I think this would be hugely disrupting for patients and for hospitals. You've heard what the managers have been saying. It could endanger patients' lives, and I think that's something that neither the doctors nor the government want to see.
OK, Libby, thank you very much indeed for that.
Until now, the consensus within the medical community has been staunchly behind the junior doctors. Today, that support is starting to show cracks. English junior doctors and their representatives are coming under increasing pressure to drop that 5-day strike for 4 consecutive months, a level of industrial action that NHS England is calling unprecedented in its history. The government's warned it will risk lives, but it's the more measured criticism from within their own medical profession that may damage their cause more. So has the BMA union mishandled this action, both in misjudging the mood and in its strategy for industrial action itself? Here's Chris Cook.
After a few months away from the picket line, the doctors' union will soon return.
No ifs, no buts, no junior doctor cuts.
The junior doctors' industrial action is being expanded and extended.
Hub must go! Hub must go!
They've been on strike before, but the junior doctors have never been in such conflict with the government.
We don't want to take industrial action at all. All this would take is the government saying to us right now, we're going to lift the imposition. We are going to stop the imposition. We are not going to force a contract upon junior doctors.
This is a deal that is safe for patients. The government is putting patients first. The BMA should be putting patients first, not playing politics.
How then did we get here? Well, earlier this year, the British Medical Association and the government cut a deal on junior doctors' pay. That deal was then put to BMA members in a referendum, but they rejected it. The government, though, imposed that contract anyway. And as a consequence, the BMA has now gone on strike again. But this time is not for 1 or 2 days at a time. They're going on strike for 5 complete days in working hours at a stretch. In total, they've penciled in 20 strike days. The junior doctors are proposing to give up a lot to signal their seriousness about stopping this contract being forced on them.
I'm going on strike because I feel I don't have any choice left. The government aren't listening to us. They're trying to impose a contract on us that stretches us from 5 days to 7 when we're already struggling with 5. We have an ageing population posing a demographic bomb which is exploding all around us, and we have rota gaps throughout hospitals. We've had reports of units closing in Oxfordshire today because they don't have enough junior doctors to staff them. This isn't the time to be asking us to stretch elective services to 7 days.
A striking aspect of this process has been a lot of discussion in other British trade unions about the BMA's strategy. We spent today collecting the thoughts of senior officials from those unions. On some issues, there was a bit of division. For example, the question of whether BMA members were shrewd to reject the contract proposal. Some people from radical left unions told us that they thought it was a good idea because it would mean the government would know it would have to make a much better offer to the BMA if it was to win over its members. They thought it would stop chumminess between the BMA and the government. Others though, and this was the majority of the union officials we spoke to, they thought it was a disaster. They thought it would mean the BMA's leadership had been cut off at the knees, that the government would be able to argue that its leadership couldn't speak for its members. The BMA is also in the awkward position of striking to oppose a contract that was embraced by the union's leaders just a few months ago.
We have managed to reach an agreement on a contract that we believe is safe for both patients and doctors, and is also fair for junior doctors, and it really values their time, it values them as part of the workforce.
I don't think the union has changed its mind. The decision's been put to the members. The members have decided that they don't accept this contract. 58% of us have. That is in contradiction to some of the members of the executive committee who thought it was a good contract. The majority of us don't, and our union's representing us as it should.
Something else that union officers brought up was the BMA's very unusual structure as a union, something that puts a lot of responsibility in the hands of very inexperienced union officials. You can see that, they said, in the contents of leaks from the union, as well as the fact that so much leaks from this union. Union officers elsewhere were shocked by an apparent lack of clear strategy. But the junior doctors will need to be politically skillful to avoid being blamed for coming trouble in hospitals.
The problem with having a strike of this scale is that they're likely to both lose income from the work that they would have been doing during the strike, and of course the patients will end up waiting longer, so they have the opportunity to fail on both their financial and activity targets. And the consequence of that is they lose potentially a lot of money, which will mean that, given that their finances are already very much on a knife edge, that we will see hospitals running into further difficulty later this year as a consequence of the strike in a number of places.
For all that, the Department of Health tonight sounded unfazed at the BMA's new plans. Right now, there's no sign of peace.
Chris Cook there, and we asked the BMA and the government to come in tonight to respond to the criticisms made, but they were unavailable. Joining us now, though, junior Dr. Rachel Clark, who's been a vocal campaigner for strike action. Dr. Clark, thanks very much for coming in. And a lot of people understand that there are junior doctors, there are medics who, frankly, have been pushed to the end of their tether by all this and have reached for the nuclear option. But fundamentally, it's very hard for you to sell to the public this change of heart when you seem so close to a deal so recently.
To some extent, I absolutely agree with that. It's how do we, as doctors, forsake our patients for 5 days at a stretch? And I know that every day I went on strike in the preceding year, I cried on my way to the picket line. I felt guilty. I felt as though I was doing something that I absolutely did not want to do. And I think that every individual doctor who goes on strike from September the 12th is going to go through all those emotions as well, because fundamentally we feel as though what we're doing goes against the grain of our ingrained work ethic. But when questioning the proportionality of a strike, I think you have to do that in the context of assessing the potential harm of the strike, and there is definite harm from the strike because we know that patients are going to have their elective operations cancelled, for example. But you have to assess that against the harm of the action that you're trying to avoid.
And that's totally understandable, but it's a slightly different point to the one I've made, which is that fundamentally it is very hard for you to turn around to the public and say, you know how we were very close to that deal and we were all going to go with that deal. We're not now, for exactly the same reasons that we could have made 6 months earlier.
So I think that question rests on a fundamental misunderstanding of what this dispute is about for grassroots junior doctors. There has been a year of negotiation, and you're absolutely right. In that interview, one of my BMA representatives said they thought that the final deal was a good one. I never thought that deal was a good one, and nor did a great many of my fellow grassroots doctors.
But you were prepared at one point to support it, were you not?
It is one thing to think that something is the best of a bad possible set of options on the table. That's not the same as supporting it. Fundamentally...
But you would have, at that point, you would have voted yes. And we just heard from Ellen McCourt, the one you raised, who said, we believe it's safe for patients, safe for doctors, and it values the workforce. Now, why would her mind have suddenly changed?
So to answer that point, for the last year, the BMA has sought to negotiate a new contract which will deliver a 7-day NHS cost neutrally. That was the government's stipulation. They said, we insist that not only will your new contract be cost neutral, it must somehow nonetheless deliver these fantastic new services that we so support and are committed to at the weekend, in the absence of any funds and any staff. Now, we know that not only do junior doctors feel deeply, deeply anxious about the idea that we can be stretched more thinly and somehow still be safe at the weekend, we know that Jeremy Hunt's own officials in the Department of Health share that queasiness through leaked internal documents, their own risk assessments, a 5 out of 5 severity risk that there aren't enough staff or funds to deliver this policy safely.
Do you think, frankly, then, that the BMA screwed this up for all of you?
No, I don't. I wish that a year ago the BMA had called out the government on the ludicrousness.
They spent 8 days at ACAS negotiating with the government, and now they're back into what we hear as an unprecedented strike, and you've talked about the worries you have already with that. Why would the government trust any new negotiation at this point when the last one was
perhaps
reneged?
Because what you've just described is actually the democratic process. So the BMA may have delivered what they felt was the best deal that on the table.
They're out of step with their members.
Indeed, and it's ironic, isn't it? Because for this entire year, Jeremy Hunt portrayed the BMA as the radicals, the Trotskyists, the militants who are leading us all into this dreadful fight that we were too misguided to realise was extreme. Ironically enough...
And they weren't hardline enough for you?
Well, far from it. What I objected to from the outset and what I object to now is the political game playing, and Theresa May is wholly wrong when she says it's doctors who are playing games. It's the political game playing of presenting the electorate with an unfunded soundbite and pretending that that is a policy. Nobody gets something for nothing. We all know that. That's why we still have the public support. It's because the public knows that if the government were really genuinely committed to safer weekends, they would fund them, they would staff them. In Oxfordshire, where I work, my local DGH, a hospital, a district general hospital in Banbury, has just closed its entire maternity service because they don't have enough junior doctors.
Do you still think, bluntly, you can win this, or will it turn into something akin to a minor strike, which is how one doctor described it to me tonight?
I think that what has to happen this week is absolutely everything humanly possible to try and prevent the strike. And I think if Jeremy Hunt had any shred of commitment to patients, literally all he needs to do is pause in position. He could have a pause. He's not saying he's rejecting the 7-day NHS, he's giving up on it. He's not losing face. He's simply saying, we must come together for patients and pause this. That's literally all he needs to do. And if he does that, the strike goes away, they're back around the table and talking. And why he's not doing that, I simply can't understand.
Dr. Clark, thank you very much. Thanks for coming in.
I've been getting away with it all my